All right, let's talk about a guy who was, by all accounts, a brilliant Catholic priest, a deeply devoted Jesuit. But he ended up becoming one of the church's most famous rebels, a man whose ideas would seriously shake the foundations of Catholic theology at the turn of the 20th century. This is the incredible story of George Tyrrell. Okay, let's just start with this quote. I mean, wow. May not Catholicism have to die in order that it may live again? Keep in mind, this wasn't some outsider or enemy of the church saying this. This was Tyrrell himself, a priest. So the real question for us is, how did a man who gave his entire life to the church end up challenging its very core and ultimately getting excommunicated? You see, to get the rebel, you first have to understand the believer. George Tyrrell wasn't even born Catholic. He actually converted from the Anglican Church back in 1879 because he was looking for what he called greater intellectual coherence. And he didn't just dip his toe in, he went all in, becoming a Jesuit and a passionate defender of traditional Catholic thought. Now, to really get a handle on his journey, you gotta see it in 3x. It's fascinating. He starts out as a militant Thomist, right? A total defender of tradition. Then he shifts into being a mediating liberal, trying to, build some bridges. And then finally, he becomes a radical modernist, the man who goes head-to-head with Rome itself. So let's break down how he got from point A to point C. So in that first period, Tyrrell was a Thomist. What does that mean? Well, it means he followed the philosophy of Saint Thomas Aquinas, a giant in Catholic history, who really focused on using reason and tradition to understand faith. For Tyrrell, this was the bedrock, the perfect tool to reform the church from the inside, using its own best traditions against its weaknesses. And this quote, man, it gives you a perfect window into his early game plan. He knew the church needed to grapple with modern ideas, but he was also smart enough to know that if he presented them as something new or alien, they'd get shot down immediately. So his plan was to use the super-respected figure of Aquinas as a kind of Trojan horse, a cover to sneak in some new thinking without setting off all the alarms. But that strategy, that quiet internal reform, well, it wasn't gonna last. A single meeting was about to send Tyrrell's life and his work in a totally new and, frankly, much more dangerous direction. This is where he starts to turn toward what became known as modernism. The year is 1896. This is the turning point. Tyrrell meets this guy, Baron von Hugel, a major Catholic intellectual. And von Hugel introduces him to a revolutionary new way of reading the Bible and church history, the historical critical method. Basically, it meant analyzing these sacred texts like any other historical document. And for Tyrrell, this was a mind-blowing revelation. It started raising some really tough questions about doctrines he'd always taken for granted. And that encounter shoved Tyrrell right into the middle of this controversial new movement, Catholic modernism. Now, the modernists weren't trying to tear down the faith. They saw themselves as trying to save it. They wanted to connect the ancient truths of Catholicism with all the new stuff the modern world was figuring out about history and science. But for the Vatican, this was like playing with matches in a fireworks factory. So this is what's known as his second period. His goal wasn't just quiet reform anymore. It was mediating liberalism. He was actively trying to present Catholicism to the modern mind. It was a delicate balancing act, and as it turned out, pretty much an impossible one. And that balancing act is what pushed him into his third and most radical phase. This is where Tyrrell cooks up the ideas that would put him on a direct collision course with the official church. He starts to argue that the real foundation of faith isn't just a set of rules handed down from above, but something much more personal, much more real. Here's the conflict in a nutshell. On one side, you have the standard scholastic theology, which Tyrrell now saw as just a system of excessive abstraction and vague unreality. But on the other side is his vision. Theology has to be tested constantly by the facts of lived experience. How do real people actually live out their faith every single day? So how does this test of his actually work? Well, Tyrrell basically flips the whole traditional model upside down. He says you have to start with lex orandi, the law of prayer, the actual lived spiritual life of everyday believers. Then you use that reality to test the lex credendi, the law of belief, the official doctrines. And here's the kicker. For him, the ultimate measure of any doctrine is the spiritual life it actually produces. If it doesn't work in real life, it's just an empty formula. And this quote just nails his whole point. For Tyrrell, right belief, orthodoxy, wasn't just decided by popes and councils. He argued it was selected and kept alive over centuries by the collective need of the soul. It's the spiritual experience of the community that truly proves a doctrine is true, not just some intellectual decree from on high. So you can probably see where this is all heading, right? Putting the authority of personal experience right up there with or even above the authority of the institution, well, that was a direct challenge to the Vatican. It's that timeless conflict, the individual conscience versus the established power. And for Tyrrell, it put him on an unavoidable collision course. At this point, the time for gentle persuasion and Trojan horses was over. Tyrrell's writing becomes ever more strident. He stops trying to build bridges and starts pointing out what he sees as a fundamental incompatibility between the Church's doctrines and what modern history was uncovering. He was basically forcing a confrontation. And that confrontation arrived. In 1906, the first hammer comes down. After decades of serving, teaching, and writing as a Jesuit, George Tyrrell is kicked out of the Society of Jesus. Just like that, he was a priest without a home. The very next year, the Vatican responds with everything it's got. Pope Pius X issues a huge encyclical, Pascendi Dominici Gregis, and it doesn't just criticize modernism, it condemns it as the synthesis of all heresies. I mean, you can't get much more forceful than that. The door for any kind of dialogue was slammed shut, locked, and bolted. But Tyrrell refused to be quiet. In what was just a stunning act of public defiance, he writes 2 letters to the Times newspaper in London, openly rejecting the Pope's condemnation. For the Church, this was it. This was the final, unforgivable act of rebellion. And so, in that same year, 1907, the final judgment came. George Tyrrell was formally excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church. The man who had joined the Church looking for intellectual coherence was now officially cast out as a heretic. His rebellion, though, was tragically brief. Just 2 years after his excommunication, George Tyrrell died. He was only 46 years old, and in a final sign of his break from the institution he once loved, he was denied a Catholic burial. So, what do we make of this whole journey? He started as this loyal reformer, trying to sneak new ideas in under cover of Aquinas, and ended up an excommunicated rebel, the face of a movement branded the synthesis of all heresies. And this is why his story still matters so much today. Tyrrell himself died, but the questions he raised are absolutely still being debated, not just in Catholicism, but in any faith that's trying to deal with the modern world. How does faith square with history? How do ancient beliefs meet modern science? And is personal, lived experience a valid way to measure truth? Which leaves us with the big final question. Was George Tyrrell a heretic? A guy whose ideas really did threaten the foundations of his faith? Or was he a prophet? A man who was way ahead of his time, who saw the painful, difficult evolution his church would have to go through to survive in the modern world? Now that's a question worth thinking about.